It was October of 1987. There was this little girl named Jessica McClure. This story was probably going to sound familiar to maybe a few of you, but Jessica was 18 months old when she was playing in her aunt's backyard in Midland, Texas. And while she was running around and playing, she stumbled and she fell into a deep well. The well was only about 8 inches wide, but she fell about 20 feet underground, out of reach of her family, completely alone. And for 58 hours, rescuers worked around the clock tirelessly, trying to figure out some way that they could get to this little girl. They knew that it wouldn't be easy. The hole was narrow, the soil was rocky, and there was no clear or easy path to get to Jessica. And in spite of their caution and in spite of their hard work, they faced all kinds of challenges, broken equipment, and the progress was slow. And in every move, they were running the risk that the entire well would just crumble on top of this baby. Above ground, her family waited breathlessly, feeling completely helpless, listening for updates, hoping to find any sign that baby Jessica was still alive. The rescuers said, and they would report to the family from time to time, that they could hear her softly crying to herself. Or then they would also talk about how every once in a while they felt like they could hear her singing little songs to herself. And those sounds, those little baby noises kept them going. And while all this was happening, the nation was watching. Maybe some of you were watching as news stations carried live updates and people gathered around televisions and homes and in restaurants, and strangers, they prayed. And for these 2+ days, millions of people were united around this little girl's life. But then finally, after more than 2 days, a paramedic squeezed through a narrow tunnel and reached Jessica and gently pulled her free. And when she emerged, she was alive. And the response was immediate. People cried and they hugged. They celebrated across the nation the news of Jessica's rescue, which had felt so unlikely for so long. And while Jessica survived, she had broken bones and she faced a long recovery. Literally years of recovery. But the story stays with people for a different reason. It stays with people because it's a reminder of what desperation does. Desperation strips away at everything until you're only left with what matters the most. Desperation is a powerful thing. It can bring clarity. We see it whenever we're at the end of our rope and we've exhausted all of our resources, but we know that we have to continue to press on. Another way to say that is desperation stares less than ideal circumstances in the face and says, I'm going to do whatever needs to be done to get something done. And every single one of us, in some way, shape, or form, understands what it means to be desperate. And we all know that desperation can come in an instant with a phone call, or desperation can grow over time. Maybe at some point you felt desperate over your health or the health of someone you love. Maybe it's unforeseen circumstances or that have just in an instant changed your priorities. Maybe you felt desperate because of financial situations, financial stability. Maybe today you go and fill up your car for gas and you just look at that number going really high, really fast, and you start to feel just a little bit desperate. We can feel desperate in relationships, in a marriage with internal battles and mental health struggles, feeling like time is slipping away, or even spiritually, you can feel desperate whenever you feel like your prayers don't make it past the ceiling. Desperation is something that we all understand to varying degrees. And so today, we're in week 3 of the second section of our series, Encounters. And during this portion of this series, all we've been doing is looking at different encounters that Jesus had with different women throughout his life and ministry. And so this morning, we're going to look at a story that actually includes 2 people, and both of them are desperate in their own way. You have a desperate dad, and you have a desperate woman. One of them is a respected religious leader who was powerful, but now he is powerless with what he's facing. The other was an outcast who was just willing to do whatever needed to be done to find hope. But you can't tell either one of their stories without the context of the other. So here's where we are, Luke chapter 8. And Jesus, he's just finished calming a storm, and he's just finished healing a demon-possessed man. And in doing so, he's shown that he has authority over nature and the storms, and he has authority over the spiritual world and demons. But after he does this, he crosses over the lake, and all kinds of people have heard about Jesus. They know who he is, and people have traveled from far and wide to see him. The locals have completely cleared their schedules, and there was this huge crowd that was waiting for him. And it seems that within this crowd, there were many who were desperate for him. So beginning in Luke chapter 8, verse 40, this is what we read. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. But then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came, and if you have a physical Bible, underline these next words, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Jairus, he held a very important position. He was known. He was a respected spiritual leader. He was powerful. But whenever he heard that Jesus was coming, he rushed and he got to the very front of the line. And Jairus did something that most respected people, most respected leaders, most respected spiritual leaders would not have done in his day. He did something that most men who were of his stature would not have done in his day. He went and he threw himself at the feet of another man. But why did he do this? Verse 42 says, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12 years old, was dying. He threw himself at Jesus' feet because he was desperate. His little girl was dying, and desperation can cause us to do some pretty out-of-character things. It can cause us to completely forget our ego, to swallow our pride, and to do things that we otherwise would never do. Luke tells us that this was Jairus' only child, which makes you wonder, was this little girl, was she a miracle baby for this family? A large family was normally the desire for families at this time, but having children was hard. And many kids in this culture, they just simply didn't make it. Pregnancy and delivery were so very dangerous. No modern medicine, no anesthesia, no surgical safety nets. And in addition to all this, childbirth was one of the leading causes to women in that day. And then infant mortality was also extremely high due to illness or complications or premature birth. And this was so true that it wasn't uncommon for families, for parents at this time, to wait weeks, plural, before they would even name their children, because they just had no real idea if they were going to make it or not. But one thing that is clear to me here is that Jairus is a good dad. Kelsey, she talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that dads largely got to decide the fate of their children. And in a day and age whenever family lineage was such a high priority, families seemed to really prefer having a son to a daughter. And so if they had a daughter, it wasn't uncommon for dads to decide that they just didn't want them. And they would leave them out in the elements for either somebody else to come and take care of them or for them to just die. But we can see that Jairus wasn't that kind of dad. He wasn't that kind of father. He was a good father. He loves his daughter, so he comes begging, Jesus, you have to come to my home. My baby girl is sick, and you have to do something. And so Jesus, he agrees, and he begins to make his way. And as he was on his way, verse 42 says that the crowds almost crushed him. It's such a vivid story here. You can see it in your mind's eye that this is no place for the claustrophobic. I picture Jairus like grabbing Jesus by the wrist and shooing people out of his way with the other hand as he's trying to weave in and out of the crowd so he can get to his house as soon as possible. The text gives us this picture that the crowd was so massive that people were crammed together so tightly that it was hard for people to even breathe. And throughout this crowd, you would imagine that there are many others who were desperate for Jesus in some way. There are others who are sick or who have sick family members. All the people there, they want to see Jesus. They want to hear Jesus. They want to be near Jesus. But many of them, you would imagine, they just desperately need Jesus. And so they're all doing everything they can to get as close as possible. And one person who fits that description in the middle of this crowd was a woman, a desperate woman in need. Verse 43 says, "And a woman was there who had been the subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her." So you have Jairus. He was a respected leader. This lady was not. She's given no name. She's only given a condition. It seems that the very same year that Jairus' daughter was born, that this lady came down with a chronic case of bleeding that would have completely wrecked her life. She spent all of her time and all of her resources trying to find some sort of a solution to her ailment, trying to find somebody who could help her. And maybe you see this, maybe you don't on the surface, but as you realize the depths of her situation, you will find that, in my opinion, this lady is one of, if not the clearest picture of brokenness in the entire New Testament. You have to remember that this is a Jewish culture, and so they're living under the Levitical law. And if you go to Leviticus chapter 15, you can read all about what this woman would have had to live through. Luke 15 tells us that because of her bleeding, she would have been considered unclean. And anyone she touches would have been considered unclean. And anything she touches would have been considered unclean. And anyone who touches anything she touches would have been considered unclean. That anywhere that she sat would have been considered unclean. And anybody who sat anywhere she sat, they also would have been considered unclean. That anywhere that she laid would have been considered unclean. And anyone who laid anywhere that she had lied would have been considered unclean. And so for a dozen years, nobody has wanted to be anywhere near this lady. She's been avoided like the plague because any interaction with her would have made you unclean. Meaning that you couldn't go to the temple, meaning you couldn't offer sacrifices, meaning you couldn't go and worship. So she is a prisoner of her own reputation. Perhaps she's living with shame. I would imagine she was living with some kind of embarrassment, but she was definitely living with the feeling that she was less than everyone else. For 12 years, no one has wanted to touch her. For 12 years, no one's wanted to hug her. For 12 years, no one's kissed her, no one has loved her. Not many, if any, have sat down and just had a conversation with her. She doesn't have somebody who asks her how her day was. She's been excluded, avoided. She's an outcast. If she has a family, they're likely gone. If she doesn't have a family or dreamed of having a family, those dreams are likely gone too. She continually eats alone. She lives alone. She's totally and completely alone. And she's desperate for Jesus. And she knows that it's a risk, like simply being in this location was a risk. But she's thinking, if I can just get to Jesus. So she came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak. And immediately her bleeding stopped. She's healed. She believed in her heart that if she can just touch the edge of Jesus' garment, she doesn't have to have Jesus lay hands on her. She doesn't even need Jesus to say a word to her. But she had so much faith in who Jesus was that she believed, if I can just touch the fringe of his robe, everything will be okay. And I hope that we never miss this beautiful truth. I promise every time that we see it in Scripture, I will take the time to repeat it until we become completely sick of it or until it finally gets through our little skulls. But anytime that Jesus goes and encounters the unclean, Jesus does not become unclean. But instead, his cleanness and his righteousness is transferred onto them to make them clean. And the same is true for us today. No matter how dirty we are, no matter how broken we are. But Jesus noticed what she had done and what she was trying to do in quiet. And so he asked this question. It's a silly question. But he asked, who touched me? And Peter's kind of like, what do you mean, Jesus? Like, we're crammed in this place. The answer to who touched you is literally everyone. Like, that person touched you, that person touched you, that person touched you. But Jesus said, no. Someone touched me, I know, because the power has gone out from me. This actually tells us something really important about who Jesus is. When Jesus would use his power to heal people, to help people, to restore, to rescue, It was never effortless and it was never detached. And it always cost him something. When he calmed the storm, whenever he freed the man who was possessed by demons, he wasn't just going through the motions. It was a real outpouring of something. It was a real outpouring of love that was happening. And here's what's so interesting to me. Jesus isn't just randomly healing people in this crowd because he knows and he can sense that his power has gone out to a specific person for a specific reason. Luke doesn't tell us in the middle of this mob that as everybody's kind of, up against each other and they're all crammed together, Luke doesn't tell us that everyone brushing up against Jesus is healed. All those who were hurt or all those who were sick, or he doesn't say that all of them are getting healed, but instead there's something that's intentional that's happening here. The woman, she reaches out. It wasn't accidental on her part. It was an intentional act. And at the same time, Jesus is fully aware this isn't out of his control. He's not losing power, but instead he's choosing to use it. Even in the middle of this crowd with all the chaos, Jesus is still completely in control and sovereign over all that he does and everyone that he heals. But as you read Jesus' words, someone has touched me. I know that the power has gone out from me. You can sense this woman's anxiety starting to build. The last thing that she ever wanted to do was make a scene, but she knows that she's now going to be found out. So then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling at his feet. And in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Jesus speaks so tenderly to this broken woman. While she's likely been abandoned by her family, Jesus calls her daughter. It's a beautiful scene of redemption and restoration. It's a beautiful picture of the way that Jesus loves the least of these. But if you're Jairus right now, this has to have been unbearable, right? Like he's in a bit of emergency. He's in a bit of a panic here. I really believe that Jairus was one of the good religious leaders in his day, but now he hears Jesus say to this woman who got in the way of Jesus going to his daughter, he hears him say to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And I can only imagine what was going through Jairus' mind throughout this entire interruption. It's like, Jesus, we have to go. My daughter is dying. We don't have time for this. Plus, I got here first. I think I can kind of understand Jairus' feeling here. Whenever Ava, our second oldest daughter, she was like 2.5 years old, we had just moved to a new town. And we got invited over to a barbecue at some new friend's house just to get to know people and hang out. And Ava, she got on this merry-go-round. And there are a lot of bigger kids there, but she's on the merry-go-round. And I'm trying not to, we're trying not to be helicopter parents, so we're nowhere to be found at this moment. And the kids, they just start getting this thing going really, really fast with this 2.5-year-old little girl on there. And instead of Ava saying, "Stop the merry-go-round, I want to get off," reasoning and stuff. Instead of doing that, she just jumped off. And she landed on her arm, and she snapped both bones in her little arm. And one of the dads who was over there supervising kind of thing, he picked her up and he brought her over to me and said, "Hey, Andy, I'm pretty sure your daughter just broke her arm." And I looked at her arm and I was like, "Yep, she just broke her arm." Like it was one of those kinds of breaks. And so we load her up, we put her in the car, and we get to the emergency room as fast as we can. And I walk into the emergency room and my heart just leaps for so much joy because it was actually an empty emergency room. And I was like, "Oh my goodness, my daughter's going to get help quickly." And so we go and we fill out all the paperwork and everything's good. And we go and we sit down waiting for them to call us back to the back. Well, about 10 minutes later, in come these 17, 18, 19-year-old guys. One of them's holding a T-shirt to his head because, and I heard them talking about how, laughing, joking, they all were acting like a bunch of idiots. And they were swinging bats around, and one of them got hit in the head with a bat. And I was like, these idiots better not get in the way of my daughter. But then the nurse comes to the waiting room to call the first person back. And who do they call? They call the idiot. And I was just like, what do you mean? My daughter is hurt. My daughter has been here longer. We got here first. It's not my fault they're stupid. Like we got here first. I'd have to imagine that Jairus is probably in a similar place. And so as Jesus is getting ready to continue to Jairus' home, someone from his house, he comes and tells him, like, leave the teacher alone. It's too late. Your daughter's dead. The scripture doesn't tell us exactly what was going through Jairus' mind, but I would imagine in the midst of his brokenness and just receiving this news, his thoughts were probably not too kind towards this woman. She was already despised socially and culturally. She shouldn't even have been there. But now she's caused Jesus to be late. And it echoes the story of Mary and Martha after their brother Lazarus had died. And Jesus waited days before coming to Lazarus' home. And whenever he shows up, Mary and Martha, they go out to Jesus and they just simply say, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. But Jesus had something greater in mind then, and he has something greater in mind now. So Jesus, he still makes his way to Jairus' house, even though he was told not to. And whenever they show up, he tells Jairus, hey man, everything's going to be okay. He says, your daughter is not dead. She's only asleep. And verse 53 says that those around, that they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. So who's laughing here? Jesus says she's not dead, and people start to laugh. Who's laughing? It's not the disciples, and it's not the parents. But instead, it was this crowd who was outside of Jairus' home, who were, in essence, these professional mourners. It's kind of interesting as we were looking over and knowing that this was the message this week. I was scrolling through Twitter or X this week, and I saw that a story that there is still this occupation that exists in Western Kenya. But the occupation is simply this. Whenever somebody dies, there's a group of people who is paid to come and wail and cry and mourn and play music at funerals. And so anytime that somebody would die, they would show up quickly. And the scene, so whenever Jesus showed up, the scene was already loud. It was emotional. And when he says that she's not dead, they all laugh because they've seen a dead body before. Their entire occupation revolves around being around dead bodies. And so they're sure of what they're looking at. But while they may understand death, they don't understand who Jesus is. And so Jesus, he goes in and he takes the little girl by the hand. And again, the dead body would have been considered unclean. But the corpse's uncleanness doesn't make Jesus unclean. Instead, his righteousness makes her clean. And Jesus said, my child, get up. And her spirit returned. And at once she stood up, and then Jesus told them, go and get her something to eat, get her some strength, some nourishment. And her parents were astonished. They were overwhelmed by what they had seen. But he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. So you have these two people from two completely different backgrounds. You had two people who were far more similar than what they could have ever imagined. Two people who were loved by Jesus in very real and tangible ways, and two people who learned a very important lesson. That God is present in our pain and in our desperation. They had different problems, but they had the same solution. They both needed to reach out to Jesus. So let me ask you a question this morning. What do you do when Jesus doesn't move at your pace? When you feel like healing is delayed? When your fear grows louder? When a situation looks like it's beyond repair, how do you respond? In this text, we see two different models of faith. You see the hidden reach of the woman, and you see the trembling trust of Jairus. And both of them are enough, because the power is never found in the aesthetic of your faith, but instead the power is found in the one in whom your faith is placed. It's probably around early 2009. I was a lead minister for the very first time in my life. I was like 26 years old, something around like that. And I was getting ready to preach my second Easter sermon ever. And since I'd already done one, I figured, you know what? Now it's time to spice up this story, spice up this service just a little bit. And I was an idiot. I would have been the one, with the towel on my head going after being hit in the head with a bat. But for whatever reason, I had enough brains to talk to my elders about what I was wanting to do. And I told them that I wanted to actually preach the story of Jairus and the bleeding woman on Easter. I was young, and they were kind, and eventually they ultimately just said, yeah, Andy, I don't think that would be a very good idea. And looking back, they were 100% right. It was a really dumb request that I had made. It's like people are coming in expecting to hear the greatest story of hope in human history, the resurrection of Jesus. Let me talk to you about a bleeding woman. But I relented and I talked about the resurrection. But my reasoning for wanting to talk about this story on Easter still stands. Jesus' resurrection brings hope to the world. And do you know who needs hope the most? It's those who are broken. It's those who are hopeless. And this story is a picture of how the living Christ loves and interacts and gives hope to the hopeless. And again, it points to something that is so powerful. Every time Jesus touches someone who is unclean, someone who is hopeless, someone who is sick or ashamed or even dead, something unexpected happens. Instead of him becoming unclean, they become whole, they become clean, and they become new. In this world, uncleanness was supposed to spread, but with Jesus, it works in the opposite way. His wholeness would spread instead. And that's not just a powerful moment in this story, but it's also a preview of the cross. Because on the cross, Jesus doesn't just come near our brokenness. He takes our brokenness upon himself, our sin, our shame, our uncleanness, and all of it is placed on him. And he absorbs what should have been ours. So when we stop and we see Jesus stop for this woman and restore her, when we see Jesus go and heal this father's little girl, we're simply just seeing a glimpse of what he has come to do for every single one of us. To take what is broken and to give us his wholeness and his righteousness in return. And church, that's where we place our faith. That's why we surrender our lives. Yes, sometimes our faith, it is scared and it is hiding, and other times it is bold and it is trembling. But truly, it's not about what your faith looks like. It's about the one in whom your faith is found. And I believe that Jesus would say to each and every one of us, in the midst of your brokenness, in the midst of your desperation, he would say, would you just come to me? Bring all of your hopelessness to me. Bring all of your brokenness to me. Just come to me with whatever it is that you have. Because he already knows what we're hiding. He already knows the patterns of our lives that we just can't seem to break. He already knows how inconsistent our faith can be, how distracted our prayers can be. He's fully aware of every single moment of doubt that you and I live with. But in spite of it all, to quote Brennan Manning, Jesus still says, I dare you to believe that I love you. I dare you to believe that I love you. And he's not talking about the version of you that you're trying to become. He's not talking about the version of you that you wish you were. But you, broken and bruised right now, just as you are. I dare you to believe that Jesus really loves you. Do you believe that? Do you believe Jesus really loves you? Jairus did. And this woman did. In their faith, they both looked different, and neither was perfect, but they dared to believe that Jesus loved them enough to heal their brokenness. Because they understood that it's not about what your faith looks like, but instead it's all about the one in whom your faith is found. Will you pray with me this morning? Father in heaven, I thank you for today and just this opportunity to be in this place. And God, I thank you for the way that you have worked in our lives, in the way that you've drawn near to us in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our hurt and our shame. And so, Father, right now, I pray for every single person in this room. Maybe there are some who find themselves in a very, very desperate situation today. I pray that they would bring that to you. Father, I pray for those who may find themselves just feeling completely broken and hopeless today. I pray that the hope of your resurrection will resurrect their hearts. And Jesus, I just pray that in all things and in all parts of our lives, and the parts that we're proud of and the parts that we're not proud of, that we would allow you to be glorified in us. So Jesus, thank you for loving us. Thank you for dying for us. Thank you for making a way for us. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.